Today we're going to start chapter 11, but we're also starting the very last unit for this semester, you guys. Yay! We're going to do the biochemistry part of this class. And biochemistry deals with biomolecules. Biomolecules are there's four main groups and you find them in living things. They're carbohydrates, which we're going to talk about now. They're proteins, they're lipids, and they're nucleic acids. Those are the four big biomolecules, and so we're going to break them down one chapter at a time. But again, we're going to talk about their structure and their function and how they relate to living things. Okay, so carbohydrates is what we're going to talk about first. And carbohydrates, half of all organic compounds are carbohydrates. Remember, if it has carbon, it's organic, right? And organic compounds are about 95% of all things, all compounds. So, take half of that and you've got your carbohydrates. So it's a big group, okay? Plants make carbohydrates from oxygen, or they make carbohydrates and oxygen, excuse me, and all they need to make them is carbon dioxide and water plus sunlight. So that's photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is the process of taking carbon dioxide and water, adding light, and then you end up with usually glucose, which is a carbohydrate, and oxygen. So it works out great because we need oxygen and carbohydrates, and we give off carbon dioxide and water. Okay. When they have a lot of glucose, plants will store it. They'll put a bunch of them together and make a very complex carbohydrate called starch. If you want to see starch, cut a potato in half. All that white stuff, that's starch. That's a bunch of glucose molecules stuck together. When we eat starch, what we do is we start to break it down first mechanically just by tearing it up by chewing it. But there's an enzyme in our mouth called amylase, and it starts to break it down. And if you want to check out amylase, if you take a cracker and keep chewing it and don't swallow it, eventually it'll taste sweet. Eventually you'll take that starchy cracker and break it down into its glucose. But it takes a while. It's kind of gross if you keep eating a cracker that long. Anyway, the other place that you'll get digestion occurring is in the small intestine. And then again, more enzymes are being added. And eventually it'll break it down from this big complex carbohydrate starch into smaller pieces, glucose. And that's what we need in our cells. That's where we get our energy. Okay. We use carbohydrates for so many things. But then number one is fuel. Okay. In your cells, glucose goes through a process called glycolysis, and it makes us ATP, and ATP gives us energy. Okay. Energy to do everything. Move, talk, walk, for our nerve cells to function, all that stuff. They all need ATP, and ATP is energy we get from breaking down glucose. Okay. So you'll also find glucose or carbohydrates, excuse me, in building blocks of RNA and DNA. So that would be for our proteins. And they also use in cellular recognition, in other words, like for hormones and things like that. So there's all kinds of things that we use it for. The general structure of a carbohydrate you see is carbon and water. These guys the N could be 2 groups, it could be 250 groups. It just depends on the carbohydrate. But if you look, it's carbon plus water, and that's where the name carbohydrate comes from. It's carbon that's been hydrated, carbon that water's been added to it, okay? And they're called polyols, which means there's a bunch of these. But they keep the name as carbohydrates because really it describes pretty much what it is. It's carbon with hydrogen. This is the general form, like I said, and then you can put as many of these units together as you want. Okay, so the most common or the smallest unit of a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, and saccharide usually means sugar. Okay, so monosaccharides, there's a number of carbons in a chain, usually 5 or 6, and they have either an aldehyde, which would be on the first carbon, or a ketone, which would be on the second carbon. See, a ketone couldn't be on the first, then that would be an aldehyde. Their centers, they have chirocenters, which means they spin one way or they spin the other way. Okay. Common monosaccharides usually are straight chain of 3 to 6 carbons with an aldehyde on the first one or a ketone on the second one. Okay. And then all the rest of them have hydroxyl groups. They have OH groups. So you'll have a carbon with a double bond O on it. And then every other carbon, if let's say there's 5 of them, will have an OH group on them. Or you'll have a carbon with an OH on the first one and a double bond on the second one, and that would be your ketone. Okay, so when you look at carbohydrates, most of them end in OSE. Glucose, fructose, lactose. Okay, that tells you If it ends in OSE, it's probably a carbohydrate. If it ends in ASE, then it's an enzyme, which would be a protein. Okay. Monosaccharides are simple sugars, and you can't break them down anymore. That's as small as you get. Glucose, like I said, is the one we really count on for everything. There's also fructose, which is fruit sugar. There's several monosaccharides, but that's as small as you get. Okay. If you put two monosaccharides together, they're called a disaccharide. Okay. The most common disaccharide that you would know is sucrose, which is the sugar you put on your cereal or whatever, the sugar that we have in our house that we use in baking and so on. Okay, you can break that one down. You can hydrolyze it. In other words, use water to break it down into two monosaccharides. Okay, there's oligosaccharides, and those are 3 or more, and we'll talk about those a little bit more when we talk about blood types. Your red blood cells have oligosaccharides on them, and again, we'll talk about them later. And then there's the polysaccharides, like starch, where you have a whole bunches of monosaccharides stuck together. And again, it makes it easier for storage. It's your fuel source and so on. So the most common things you'll see is mono, di, and poly. Oligosaccharides, again, there's 3 or more. And that tends to be, like I said, I'll show you that when we talk about blood types. Okay. Okay, so the structure. Okay, they can be either D or L depending on which way they turn. But we're not going to worry about that so much because I didn't go through that with organic. This is a 100 level class, so I promise I'm not going to blow your brains away with the D's and the L's. It just means they spin different. Okay, the only natural ones are D. Nature produces only D sugars. It doesn't produce where they spin the other way, the L. Okay, the D sugar, what happens with the D sugar is the OH group at the intersection. Okay, in other words, when you have your chain, you have your double bond O on the first one, and the OH is going to be away from it. Okay, and the group is always on the right. With an L, the group is always on the left, which is kind of nice because L left. It would have been nice if it would have been R sugar for right and L sugar for left, but that would make sense. So anyway, in nature, you only get D sugars. So your OH group always is on the carbonyl group on the right with an L sugar, it's on the left. Okay, and again, not a big deal. Just wanted to show you that and see in case it comes up. It's just a little different where the structures are. Okay, so if you look here, if it's a monosaccharide, remember they either have a double bond O on the first one, that's an aldehyde, or double bond O on the second one, that's a ketone. So we have them down here. If you look, here's a double bond O on the first one, so this would be an aldehyde. And do we have one? I guess I don't have one on the other one. Okay. Usually what happens is, they start out in a chain like this, but then if they have 5 or more carbons, they kind of just naturally form rings. So you'll see most of them like this. Okay. And again, it's the group where they stick it on. Oh, you can't see it here, and I'm sorry, you guys. But it gives it just a different structure if the OH is here or the OH is down here and so on. And again, I'm not going to have you worry about it. It's not a big deal. But the carbon-oxygen single bond forms between the oxygen and the last center. So this is, you see it here, or you'll see it, if you see down, it would be down here. So this one is up and this one is down. That's the difference between them. Not a big deal. Okay. All right. For complex carbohydrates, and again, monosaccharide is the simplest. A complex would be 2 or more. So disaccharides, that would be 2 monosaccharides. They're held together by water. Okay. If you look at this guy right here, we have lactose and we have galactose. Those are 2 simple sugars. And what happens is this OH and this H come together and form a bond. And they're hydrolyzed because HOH would be water. Okay. The disaccharides are identified in part by whatever monosaccharide they're made out of. Okay. Here's some of the common ones. You don't have to know these. I just wanted to show you. And again, this is the one we know most often. This is sucrose. It's glucose and fructose. Okay. Sucrose is the sugar that we know, the white stuff that we put in when we cook and bake and all that. Okay. This is lactose. You've probably heard of lactose before. Lactose is breaks down milk sugar, or this is milk sugar. If you're lactose intolerant, you can't break down dairy products. You have issues with that. And some of you might be lactose intolerant, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit. Here's cellulose and maltose. Maltose is malt sugar. Again, a type of sugar, and you could, have issues breaking that down. But of these, this is the one where a lot of people are missing the enzyme to break it down, and this is the most common, sucrose. Okay. When you're looking at complex carbohydrates, we have polysaccharides. They're biological polymers. In other words, they're made out of a lot of stuff. There's a lot of sugar stuck together. Okay. Here's some of the common ones: amylose, amylopectins, cellulose. This is a very common one that you'll find. This is fiber, the fiber you're supposed to have in your diet. Cellulose comes from plants. It's their strengthening structure, the cell walls that they stick together so that they can stand tall. That's what cellulose is. Okay, glycogen is the way we don't store our glucose as starch. That's what plants do. We store it as glycogen. We store it in our muscles and in our liver. Okay, so plants store energy in the form of starch. Okay, about 20% of that starch is amylose, and the other 80% is amylopectin. So these first three are just plant things. Okay, we don't have these. We eat these and then we break them down into smaller parts, but we don't make these. Okay. All right, so we store our carbohydrates. If we need that extra store of glucose, we store it as glycogen. So we take a bunch of glucose molecules. If we don't need them at the time, we don't need to put them in our cell, into our mitochondria, and break them down. So we store them as glycogen, and glycogen is similar to starch. It's a lot of glucose molecules stuck together. Okay. If you look at the plant ones, the amylose, the amylopectin, those are the two starchy ones, and glycogen, they're really formed with a lot of alpha linkages. That's not a big deal. What you need to know is there's 250 to 4,000 glucose molecules stuck together in these polymers. Okay, so there's a lot of them. Okay, amylose is unbranched and it's got a helical shape. Amylopectin is branched and it has linkage every 30 monomers. It gets spherical. So when you look at these two, again, remember 20% of plants store it this way and the other 80% is this way. So this must be a better way kind of to store it, because it stores 80% of its glucose this way. Okay, so our glycogen is branched. It's a polysaccharide, and again, it looks very similar to amylopectin or starch, except it has a little bit different branches. The branches occur like in amylopectin was every 30. So after every 30 glucose molecules, then there's a branch. In glycogen, there's only after every 10, there's a branch. Okay. Cellulose, the one I was telling you about, it doesn't have these alpha linkages. It actually has beta linkages, and we can't break it down. Okay. So if we eat cellulose, even though it's made out of glucose, it's more structural and we can't break it down. We don't have the enzymes to break down the beta linkages. We just have the alpha. So what will happen is, basically, it's fiber. Okay, it's the cell walls. You eat it, it goes through your system, and then it goes out as it came in. But it's important to get, because if you look on labels and stuff, you look for fiber, and they're always talking about fiber. Fiber helps keep your large intestine clean. It's kind of like the Roto-Rooter, just cleaning everything out. So it's important to get fiber in your diet. Okay, so we can break down starch. Okay, we have CASE. This is an enzyme. If it was OSE, it would be a carbohydrate. So we have enzymes called glycosidases. Sorry, they're able to break down starch, but we don't have the beta ones, so we can't break down cellulose. We don't digest it at all. But again, we need it to keep our colon, our large intestine, cleaned out. Okay, so if you're a cow or a horse, or what they call ruminants, they actually have bacteria in their stomach that produces those enzymes that are able to break down. So they can chew grass and they can get the carbohydrate from the grass, but they also can use the cellulose. So they use the whole plant, whereas if we eat plants, we use the glucose part of it, but we can't use the starch part, if you want to call it, but we can't use the cellulose. But again, it's important to our diet. We still need the fiber. Okay, so let me see. This is the last slide we'll do. This is just to show you, this is right out of your book, so if you want to look at it more. But like I was telling you, the structures, okay, they have different, there's the branching, here's cellulose that doesn't branch out, so we don't have the stuff to break it down. Whereas the branchy ones we do for some reason, okay? This is microscopic, I mean, this is if you looked at a